We've all heard the stories of Viking warfare, the clash of steel on steel, the roar of berserkers charging into battle, the honor-bound combat between warriors who respected their enemy's courage. Popular culture has given us images of Vikings as brutal but honorable fighters who settled their disputes through direct confrontation, where victory belonged to the strongest and bravest. We see romanticized depictions of clan warfare as a kind of medieval sport, where rival families fought over territory and resources according to established rules of engagement that, while violent, maintained certain codes of honor. But there's a darker reality that began after the battle cries faded and the weapons were set aside. What actually happened to the women of defeated clans? What fate awaited the wives, daughters, and sisters of rival families when Viking warriors decided that simple military victory wasn't sufficient revenge? What systematic horrors were unleashed when Vikings determined that destroying an enemy's bloodline required methods far more calculated and cruel than anything that happened on the battlefield? The truth, meticulously documented in saga literature, legal precedents, and archaeological evidence spanning 4 centuries of interclan warfare, reveals that Vikings developed and refined a systematic approach to sexual terrorism that was designed not merely to defeat rival clans, but to obliterate them through the systematic destruction of their women. These weren't random acts of wartime violence. They were calculated strategies of demographic warfare that treated the women of enemy clans as instruments through which entire bloodlines could be permanently destroyed. This is the story of how Viking society weaponized sexual violence into a form of warfare more devastating than any battlefield defeat, more systematic than any siege, and more permanent than any territorial conquest. It's a story told through the legal codes that sanctioned these practices, the sagas that celebrated them, and the archaeological evidence that reveals their true scope and systematic nature. The evidence for this systematic sexual terrorism comes from multiple independent sources that, when combined, reveal a coordinated approach to the destruction of rival bloodlines. The Eyrbyggja saga, Egil's saga, and the Laxdæla saga contain detailed accounts of how victorious clans treated the women of their defeated enemies. These accounts aren't presented as exceptional atrocities. They're described as standard practices that any honorable Viking clan would employ against their enemies. The Graga's and other Icelandic legal codes contain specific provisions that not only permitted, but legally protected the systematic sexual abuse of women from rival clans. These laws didn't treat such actions as crimes requiring punishment. They treated them as legitimate warfare tactics that were legally equivalent to seizing enemy property or livestock. Archaeological excavations at sites of documented clan conflicts have revealed mass graves containing predominantly female remains that show clear patterns of systematic sexual violence before death. At Mosfell in Iceland, excavations uncovered a burial site containing the remains of 37 women and children who died during a clan conflict in the 11th century. The skeletal analysis reveals evidence of prolonged sexual torture, systematic mutilation, and ritualized killing that followed established patterns documented in legal and literary sources. The Landnámabók, Iceland's comprehensive settlement record, documents over 200 instances of clan conflicts between 870 and 1200 CE, with specific references to the systematic treatment of enemy women as part of warfare strategy. These records don't describe isolated incidents. They reveal a consistent pattern of sexual violence that was considered an essential component of comprehensive victory over rival clans. Modern forensic analysis of skeletal remains from clan conflict sites across Iceland, Norway, and Denmark has revealed the systematic nature of this sexual terrorism. Isotope analysis shows that women from rival clans were often kept alive for extended periods specifically for sexual abuse before being killed, with some showing evidence of deliberate mutilation designed to maximize psychological trauma while preventing death. The genetic evidence from these sites reveals perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this system. DNA analysis shows that many of the women bore children to their captors before being killed, indicating that forced pregnancy was used as an additional form of psychological torture and bloodline contamination. The scale and systematic nature of this sexual terrorism becomes undeniable when we examine the archaeological evidence from major clan conflict sites across the Viking world. At Hjorleifshofti in Iceland, the site of a massive clan war in 982 CE, excavations have revealed a complex of holding structures specifically designed for the long-term captivity and systematic abuse of women from rival clans. The site contained 3 distinct areas that reveal the organized nature of this sexual terrorism. Capture compounds, where women were initially held after being taken from enemy settlements. Processing areas where they were systematically abused and impregnated, and disposal sites where they were eventually killed according to ritualized patterns that aligned with legal and religious practices documented in contemporary sources. Carbon dating of artifacts from the site shows that these facilities operated for over 18 months, indicating that the systematic abuse of enemy women wasn't a brief aftermath of military victory, but a long-term strategic operation designed to maximize psychological impact on surviving members of rival clans. The archaeological evidence shows that word of these systematic atrocities was deliberately spread to enemy communities as a form of psychological warfare designed to break their will to resist. The Brennu Ingjals saga provides graphic contemporary accounts of how news of systematic sexual torture was used as a weapon of terror against rival clans. The saga describes how detailed accounts of what was being done to captured women were deliberately communicated to enemy communities, creating a climate of terror that often led to the surrender or flight of entire clans without further military engagement. Archaeological analysis of the women's remains from Hjorleifshofti reveals the systematic nature of the torture they endured. The skeletal evidence shows patterns of injury consistent with prolonged sexual abuse, systematic mutilation of reproductive organs, and evidence of forced pregnancy followed by violent abortion or infanticide. The isotope analysis of these remains shows that the women were kept barely alive through minimal nutrition designed to maintain their capacity for abuse while preventing them from gaining strength that might enable resistance or escape. The Sturlunga saga documents similar facilities operating across Iceland during the 12th and 13th centuries, describing them as essential infrastructure for any clan that intended to completely destroy its enemies. The saga's descriptions of these operations align perfectly with archaeological evidence, confirming that systematic sexual terrorism had become a standardized component of Viking warfare strategy. The legal framework that governed this systematic sexual terrorism reveals how completely Viking society had integrated these practices into their understanding of legitimate warfare. The Gragas contains extensive provisions that explicitly protect Viking men who engage in sexual violence against women from rival clans, treating such actions not as criminal behavior requiring punishment, but as legitimate military tactics protected under law. The legal code specifies that sexual violence against enemy women is not only permitted, but encouraged as a means of weakening rival clans. The law provides detailed instructions for how such violence should be conducted to maximize its strategic impact, including provisions for ensuring that news of the abuse reaches enemy communities and that the psychological trauma inflicted serves the broader goal of clan warfare. Most significantly, the legal codes reveal that this systematic sexual violence was considered more effective than traditional military engagement for permanently destroying rival clans. The Frostathing law explicitly states that while military defeat could be temporary and enemies might recover their strength, the systematic sexual destruction of enemy women would permanently prevent a clan from recovering its power and population. Archaeological evidence from longhouse excavations across Viking territories reveals the infrastructure that supported this systematic sexual terrorism and demonstrates its integration into normal clan warfare operations. At Borg in the Lofoten Islands, excavations of a major clan chieftain's residence uncovered specialized chambers that were clearly designed for the long-term captivity and systematic abuse of women from rival clans. These chambers contained permanent restraint systems built into the walls, drainage systems designed to handle human waste and bodily fluids, and ventilation designed to keep captives alive during extended periods of abuse. The chambers were positioned within the main longhouse complex in ways that ensured the sounds of systematic torture would be audible throughout the residence, serving as constant reminders to household members and visitors of the clan's power over its enemies. The isotope analysis of food remains from these specialized chambers reveals the calculating nature of how captive women from rival clans were maintained. Their nutrition was carefully calibrated to keep them alive and capable of bearing children while preventing them from gaining sufficient strength to resist or attempt escape. The dietary analysis shows they received just enough protein and calories to maintain basic reproductive functions, while being systematically starved of nutrients that would support muscle development or cognitive function. Archaeological evidence from similar facilities across Iceland, Norway, and Denmark shows that by the 11th century, the systematic sexual torture of enemy women had become so standardized that specialized architectural features for this purpose were being incorporated into the design of major clan residences as a matter of routine. The breeding aspect of this systematic sexual terrorism reveals perhaps its most calculated and horrifying dimension. Viking clans didn't simply abuse and kill the women of their enemies. They systematically impregnated them as a form of biological warfare, designed to contaminate and destroy enemy bloodlines, while simultaneously producing additional slaves for their own use. The legal codes provide explicit instructions for this biological warfare strategy. The Gulating law specifies that women from rival clans should be systematically impregnated by multiple male members of the victorious clan, with their children being raised as slaves who would serve as permanent reminders of their clan's defeat and humiliation. Archaeological evidence from nursery areas at clan strongholds reveals the systematic nature of this biological terrorism. At Kaupang, excavations uncovered specialized childcare facilities specifically designed for the children born to enemy women through systematic rape. These facilities were separate from areas where the children of clan members were raised, with isotope analysis showing that the children of enemy women received deliberately inferior nutrition designed to mark their inferior status while maintaining them as useful labor. DNA analysis of remains from these facilities reveals the calculating nature of this biological warfare. Genetic analysis shows that children born to enemy women were systematically prevented from reproducing with clan members, creating a permanent caste of slaves whose genetic markers would forever identify them as the offspring of defeated enemies. The psychological warfare aspect of this systematic biological terrorism was as calculated as its genetic impact. The Njal saga describes how children born to enemy women were deliberately raised within sight of their mothers, who were forced to watch their offspring grow up as slaves, serving the clan that had destroyed their families. The psychological torture of being forced to witness their children's degradation was considered an essential component of the revenge extracted against rival clans. The systematic nature of this psychological warfare reveals the sophisticated understanding Viking society had developed regarding the most effective methods for permanently destroying enemy groups. Archaeological evidence shows that enemy women were kept alive not primarily for their labor value or even their reproductive capacity, but specifically to serve as living symbols of their clan's destruction and to suffer psychological tortures that would break their will to preserve any connection to their original identity or culture. The ritualized aspects of this systematic sexual terrorism demonstrate how completely these practices had been integrated into Viking religious and cultural frameworks. The Volsa Tatur and other sources describe how the systematic abuse of enemy women was incorporated into seasonal religious ceremonies, with their suffering being offered as sacrifices to Norse gods who were believed to favor clans that completely destroyed their enemies. Archaeological evidence from religious sites across Viking territories supports these literary accounts. At Gamla Uppsala in Sweden, excavations have uncovered ritual areas where the systematic torture of enemy women was apparently conducted as part of religious ceremonies. The site contains specialized altars with restraint systems and drainage channels designed to handle the systematic abuse and eventual sacrifice of captive women from rival clans. The isotope analysis of remains from these ritual sites reveals that women from enemy clans were transported hundreds of miles, specifically to be tortured and killed in religious ceremonies that celebrated their clan's victories over rivals. This wasn't opportunistic violence. It was organized religious terrorism that required significant logistical coordination and resources. The seasonal timing of these religious ceremonies reveals the calculating nature of this systematic terror. Archaeological evidence shows that the torture and sacrifice of enemy women was timed to coincide with major religious festivals, when representatives from multiple clans would be present to witness the systematic destruction of their enemies' women and spread news of these atrocities back to their own communities. If you value this kind of deep dive documented history, hit that subscribe button. It's the single best way to keep this channel going. And let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The economic calculations that drove this systematic sexual terrorism reveal how completely Viking society had integrated these practices into their broader strategic thinking. Medieval trade records and legal documents show that the systematic abuse of enemy women was considered a more valuable form of revenge than the seizure of property or territory, because it provided both immediate psychological satisfaction and long-term strategic advantages that could permanently weaken rival clans. The legal codes specified that clans that systematically destroyed the women of their enemies were entitled to claim additional territorial and economic rights because they had demonstrated superior strategic thinking and religious favor. The systematic sexual terrorism of enemy women was treated as evidence of clan superiority that justified expanded political and economic power. Archaeological evidence reveals the infrastructure that supported the economic aspects of this terrorism. At Birka in Sweden, excavations have uncovered specialized facilities where the systematic abuse of enemy women was organized as a form of entertainment for visiting merchants and political allies. These facilities generated significant income while simultaneously serving the strategic goal of spreading terror about the clan's treatment of its enemies. The facility at Birka contained multiple chambers designed for different forms of systematic abuse, with archaeological evidence showing that visitors paid premium prices to participate in the torture of women from specific rival clans. This commercialization of systematic sexual terrorism created economic incentives that encouraged the expansion and refinement of these practices. The trafficking networks that connected clan conflicts with systematic sexual terrorism reveal the organized nature of this industry. Archaeological evidence and written records show that specialized traders operated established routes that connected sites of clan conflicts with facilities where enemy women could be systematically abused and eventually disposed of according to religious and legal requirements. The Orkney Inga saga describes a network of facilities operating across the North Atlantic that specialized in the systematic torture of women from specific rival clans. These facilities operated according to standardized procedures that ensured the psychological impact of the abuse would be maximized while providing religious and legal justification for the systematic terrorism. Archaeological evidence from facilities in the Orkney Islands, the Shetlands, and the Faroe Islands reveals the international scope of this systematic sexual terrorism. Women from defeated clans in Iceland were transported hundreds of miles, specifically to be tortured in facilities designed to maximize their psychological trauma, while generating economic returns for the clans that operated them. The systematic record-keeping associated with this terrorism reveals its organized and calculating nature. At several sites, archaeologists have uncovered wooden tablets and carved records that tracked the systematic abuse of specific women from rival clans, including detailed records of the tortures they endured, the children they bore, and the psychological impact their treatment had on surviving members of their original communities. The social hierarchy that developed around this systematic sexual terrorism created additional layers of psychological warfare that Viking clans exploited with sophisticated understanding. Archaeological evidence reveals that some women from defeated clans were elevated to supervisory positions over other captive women, creating internal conflicts that serve the strategic goals of their captors. These elevated women received marginally better treatment in exchange for their willingness to participate in the systematic abuse of other women from their own clans. This collaboration was considered particularly valuable because it created additional psychological trauma for captive women who were forced to endure abuse from members of their own communities. The Laxdæla saga describes how this hierarchical system of collaboration was used to break down clan loyalties and create permanent psychological divisions, that's among surviving members of defeated communities. Women who collaborated in the systematic abuse of their clan sisters were eventually released to return to their communities, where their collaboration served as an additional form of psychological warfare against the defeated clan. The generational impact of this systematic sexual terrorism reveals its most calculating and permanent effects. Archaeological and genetic evidence shows that the children born to enemy women through systematic rape were deliberately raised to hate their mother's clans and to serve as permanent agents of psychological warfare against their original communities. DNA analysis from multiple generations shows that these children were systematically prevented from forming connections with their maternal heritage while being indoctrinated to view their mother's clans as enemies deserving of continued punishment. This created multi-generational cycles of violence that could permanently prevent rival clans from recovering their strength or unity. The legal codes provide explicit instructions for this generational warfare strategy. Children born to enemy women were to be raised with detailed knowledge of their mother's systematic abuse, creating psychological trauma that would prevent them from ever identifying with their maternal clans, while simultaneously serving as living reminders of their clan's defeat and humiliation. Archaeological evidence from several multi-generational sites reveals the systematic nature of this psychological conditioning. Children born to enemy women were housed in special facilities where they were systematically indoctrinated with hatred for their mother's clans, while being trained to participate in the systematic abuse of other enemy women when they reached adulthood. The territorial expansion strategies that incorporated systematic sexual terrorism reveal how these practices became integral to Viking concepts of conquest and control. Archaeological evidence shows that Viking clans that practiced systematic sexual terrorism against their enemies were able to claim and hold territory more effectively than clans that relied solely on traditional military tactics. The systematic destruction of enemy women eliminated the possibility that defeated clans could recover their population through reproduction, while the psychological terror created by news of systematic sexual abuse discouraged other clans from attempting to resist or seek revenge. This created expanding zones of control where Viking clans could operate without significant opposition. The Heimskringla describes how clans that had established reputations for systematic sexual terrorism could often claim territory simply by announcing their intention to do so, because neighboring clans would flee rather than risk having their women subjected to systematic abuse. This psychological warfare was considered more effective than traditional military conquest, because it achieved permanent results without the costs and risks associated with extended military campaigns. Archaeological evidence from border regions across Viking territories shows clear patterns of settlement abandonment that align with historical accounts of clans fleeing to avoid systematic sexual terrorism. These abandoned settlements often show signs of hasty evacuation, with valuable goods left behind, indicating that the terror of systematic sexual abuse was considered worse than the loss of property and livelihood. The religious justification that developed around systematic sexual terrorism reveals how completely these practices had been integrated into Viking cosmology and moral frameworks. The Prose Edda and other religious texts describe the systematic abuse of enemy women as a form of religious duty that demonstrated proper devotion to Norse gods, who favored clans that completely destroyed their enemies. Archaeological evidence from religious sites shows that the systematic torture of enemy women was incorporated into major religious ceremonies as offerings that would ensure continued divine favor for victorious clans. These ceremonies weren't isolated events. They were regular religious observances that required continuous supplies of enemy women to torture and sacrifice. The Havamal contains verses that explicitly encourage the systematic sexual abuse of enemy women as a form of wisdom that demonstrates understanding of how to achieve complete victory over rivals. These religious texts treat systematic sexual terrorism not as aberrant behavior, but as evidence of superior strategic thinking blessed by divine favor. The medical knowledge that developed around systematic sexual terrorism reveals the calculating expertise Viking society applied to maximizing the psychological impact of these practices. Archaeological evidence shows that Viking clans developed sophisticated techniques for prolonging the systematic abuse of enemy women while preventing them from dying before their suffering could achieve maximum strategic impact. Skeletal analysis from multiple sites reveals evidence of systematic medical intervention designed to keep enemy women alive during extended periods of torture that would normally result in death from trauma or infection. This medical knowledge was applied specifically to maximize suffering while preventing the early death that would reduce the psychological warfare value of systematic abuse. The herbal and surgical knowledge required for this systematic torture was considered specialized expertise that enhanced a clan's reputation for effective warfare. The sagas describe healers who specialized in keeping enemy women alive during systematic abuse as valuable clan assets whose skills contributed significantly to military success. The disposal methods that concluded this systematic sexual terrorism reveal its ritualized and systematic nature. Archaeological evidence shows that enemy women were killed according to established religious and legal procedures that were designed to maximize their post-mortem effectiveness as psychological warfare weapons. Mass grave sites across Viking territories contain the remains of enemy women who were killed according to identical ritualized procedures, indicating that their disposal followed standardized religious and legal requirements rather than individual preferences or random violence. The positioning of bodies, the types of injuries, and the accompanying artifacts all follow consistent patterns that reveal systematic rather than spontaneous killing. The timing of these ritualized killings was coordinated with religious festivals and political events that would maximize their impact as psychological warfare. Archaeological evidence shows that the systematic killing of enemy women was timed to coincide with seasonal gatherings, where representatives from multiple clans would witness the disposal and carry news of the systematic terrorism back to their own communities. But here's the twist that reframes everything we've learned about this systematic sexual terrorism and reveals the ultimate fate of the society that perfected it. The very mechanisms Viking clans had developed to systematically destroy the women of their enemies ultimately became the template for how they treated women within their own communities, creating a spiral of internal violence that consumed Viking society from within. As opportunities for external clan warfare decreased due to political consolidation and the spread of Christian influence, the systematic techniques that had been developed for terrorizing enemy women began to be applied within Viking communities themselves. Archaeological evidence from later Viking period sites shows that the specialized facilities, legal frameworks, and cultural practices that had been developed for systematic sexual terrorism against enemies were gradually turned inward against women from less powerful families within the same clans. The legal codes evolved to accommodate this internal application of systematic sexual terrorism. Later versions of the Gragas and other law collections contain provisions that effectively allowed powerful clan members to treat the women of their own subordinate families according to the same systematic abuse that had previously been reserved for enemies. The legal framework that had justified systematic sexual terrorism against rival clans was extended to justify systematic sexual terrorism against any women who lacked sufficient family protection or political power. Archaeological evidence reveals the systematic nature of this internal transformation. Sites that had previously contained specialized facilities for the systematic abuse of enemy women began showing evidence that these same facilities were being used against women from within the same communities. The architectural features, restraint systems, and disposal methods that had been developed for enemy women were applied with identical systematic precision against women from their own clans. The genetic evidence provides the most damning proof of this internal collapse. DNA analysis of skeletal remains from 13th and 14th century Viking sites reveals that the genetic diversity that had characterized Viking populations began showing patterns consistent with systematic sexual violence, being applied within communities rather than only against external enemies. The genetic markers that had previously indicated the incorporation of women from rival clans through systematic sexual terrorism began appearing in patterns that indicate the same systematic abuse was being applied to women from within Viking communities themselves. The techniques that had been developed to contaminate and destroy enemy bloodlines were being used to create internal hierarchies of systematic sexual exploitation. The demographic evidence reveals the ultimate consequences of this internal transformation. Archaeological analysis shows that Viking communities that had grown through the systematic incorporation of enemy women began showing clear signs of population decline and social collapse as the systematic sexual terrorism was turned inward. Settlement sites across Iceland, Norway, and Denmark show patterns of abandonment and demographic decline that coincide with evidence of increased internal systematic sexual violence. Communities that had previously expanded through systematic sexual terrorism against external enemies began contracting as the same systematic techniques were applied within their own populations. The final archaeological evidence comes from the latest Viking period sites, which show that by the 13th and 14th centuries, the systematic sexual terrorism that had once been a weapon against external enemies had become the primary mechanism through which social hierarchies were maintained within Viking communities themselves. The specialized knowledge, infrastructure, and cultural practices that had been developed for destroying rival clans had evolved into a system that systematically consumed Viking society from within. The system designed to destroy the women of enemy clans through systematic sexual terrorism had evolved into a mechanism that treated all women as potential victims of systematic abuse, regardless of their clan membership or family connections. The ritualized practices that had once demonstrated clan superiority over external enemies became the everyday methods through which powerful Vikings maintained control over their own communities. The archaeological record shows that the society that had perfected systematic sexual terrorism as a weapon against enemies ultimately applied these same systematic techniques to its own population, creating a cycle of internal violence that destroyed the demographic and social foundations that had made Viking expansion possible in the first place. What we've uncovered through archaeological analysis, legal examination, and genetic research isn't simply the story of systematic sexual violence and warfare. It's the documentation of how a society that weaponized systematic sexual terrorism against its enemies ultimately consumed itself through the application of the same systematic techniques within its own communities. The evidence is undeniable. The bones reveal systematic patterns of violence. The legal codes explicitly sanctioned and regulated these practices. And the genetic analysis shows their demographic impact across multiple generations. The systematic sexual terrorism that Viking clans inflicted on the women of their rivals wasn't an aberration or an exception to their military practices. It was a fundamental component of their warfare strategy that ultimately became the mechanism through which their society destroyed itself. In the end, the Vikings created a system of systematic sexual terrorism, so efficient and comprehensive that it eventually consumed the very communities that had perfected it, turning the specialized techniques they had developed for destroying enemy women into the everyday mechanisms through which they destroyed themselves. The archaeological evidence reveals that what began as warfare against external rivals became a system of internal oppression that systematically eliminated the demographic foundations necessary for social survival. leaving behind only the skeletal remains of what happens when systematic sexual terrorism becomes the organizing principle of an entire civilization.